Those of you that have watched my house building series may recall that we had this second tank put in, which at present is gravity fed, and it's a reserve for when the electricity goes off. And the only place that it actually feeds to is the shower room within the garage. And because it's gravity fed and we haven't been able to place it very high up, well, it doesn't give a very good pressure. It gives a trickle for a shower. We certainly can use it. I have had to use it. And it will refill the toilet, so you can flush the toilet, but it takes a while to do. And it gives a trickle out of the tap at the hand basin, but enough to clean your teeth and wash your hands. So adequate, barely adequate, I would say, when we've got no power. Now the problem is that we have long periods when we do have power, fortunately, and in the last 12 months we've probably only had 3 or 4 power outages. And what that means is that there's a lot of water sitting in that tank doing absolutely nothing. It's just basically going stagnant, and I'm concerned about that. It is covered, it's got a lid on top of it, but nevertheless things will be able to get into it. There will be contaminants in the water that gradually deteriorate, and of course there is an air gap at the top, so air is getting into the water to feed anything that might be wanting to grow there. I have on occasions run that water just through gravity to use the hose pipe just to water the garden via the hose pipe, very gentle trickle. The garden not being very much, of course, but the reality is that that's not very regular. So I've decided that I want to hook this up to the mains pump, which I think is going to be fairly straightforward, apart from the fact that the tanks are full of water. And to do the job the way I want to, I really need the tanks to be empty, or I've got to block the bottom of the tanks off so the water can't escape. So I've been drawing myself a little plan of action here, and making a list of all the joints that I need, and I'm just on my way to the garage now to see what I've got in my stock, so I don't have to buy as many as I've got on this list. The basic plan is to tee off from this pipe. Now if I turn that valve is actually off at the moment, so there's no water going down that pipe, so I could just cut the pipe below the valve there and put a T in there, and I need to put another valve in to stop the water going back to the pump when it's not necessary for it to do so. But I also need to make sure that when the pump's drawing water, it's not drawing it out of the pipes that lead to the garage. So because we'll get into a circular motion of water going into the garage and effectively coming out of the garage and going back through the pump again. Time for a coffee and a homemade bun made by yours truly, a cinnamon roll with fruit. So I'm trying to think how I'm going to do this, because my original plan unfortunately has been scuppered. I was going to move that pipe running along there this way by something like 60 centimetres. That would give me plenty of room on the top to add a valve, an isolation valve for the big tank, and join in the small tank with a T. But it's been somewhat scuppered because the pad, the concrete pad for the house corner here, is here, and so I can't get the depth that I want. But the problem with these sort of arrangements where you've got multiple pipes going in multiple directions and different feeds, etc., is you need plenty of space to put valves and corners and bends and joins in. So I've got to create myself some space. Now, the stones come up quite high there. They come up to just about underneath this joint here. I think you can probably just see a bit of discoloration here where they've been. So maybe I can still fiddle it over this pad to give myself some space, but it's just that the pipe in that area, it's going to be in stones rather than in earth, but it's never going to really be subject to any weight being in this corner. So I'm going to think along those lines now. Okay, so I think I've done half the job because I have plumbed in the village water so it will fill this small tank. And the option to fill it with from the other tank with the pump is still there, although we probably won't use that anymore. So that valve you can see there will remain off, and the village water controlled by this valve here will remain on, and hopefully there's enough pressure to fill this tank. It should be, because the other tank fills and it's about the same height at the end of the day. I just need to make sure that I have actually glued every joint, because sometimes I tend to fit them loosely so I can get my measurements and my angles, and then I forget to glue a joint, so I'm just checking everyone. Right, well, I've discovered one leak already, because I turned the water back on to the garage, and the water pressure from the pump goes down this pipe here, and it goes down underground, and then it tees off and it goes to the garage that way, but it also goes this way back to this pipe which comes from the tank. And when the valves are set in a certain way, we can have gravity feed coming down here to the garage and no pump, and vice versa. But of course the two are connected all the time, so that valve there is turned off, and the idea is that that resists the pressure from the pump so that it doesn't pump water in a circular motion back into the tank. But the underside of that is dripping there. It's dripping there, and I know the reason why, and that's because the pipes there weren't quite long enough for the joint, and I basically eased that off slightly to give a bit more space for this connection here, and basically I think I've eased off too much, and maybe the pipe isn't completely cut straight, so it's leaking from the back there. So I've got to solve that, and the way I'm going to approach it is to basically dig out the pipe that joins the two there, and I am going to then cut it just underneath the valve there, and I'm going to see if I can extract the bit from the valve body, and then I'm going to put a joint in which will basically restore it to its original and hopefully watertight position. Right, change of mind again. It's always good to be flexible. So I've cut the valve out. I thought there was no point trying to extract the leaking bit from underneath. It was too awkward a position, and the chances are I would damage the valve anyway. So I've cut that out and I'll throw that away. I've been to Non-Din-Dang to get a replacement valve. Now let me give you something of value here in terms of information. If you're ever doing DIY and use these valves, buy SCG valves. Do not buy cheaper versions that have a cap that looks like it can pull off. I'll show you. I explained this in a different video, actually, an earlier video, where one of these valves here that lead to the shower rooms was leaking from its head, and it was one like this, and this one and some other makes, the head appears to be made in two sections, and there's a little cap thing here that pushes on and probably covers up some sort of screw that fixes the actual lever in place, but it often leaks. Often being every single one that I've ever used like that has leaked, apart from this one. Now if I turn this off and then turn it back on again, I'll bet you that it would leak, and I would have to replace that valve in entirety, and that's a bloody nuisance because basically everything is now plumbed in. It happened with this one and I had to replace it before we got to the point of actually everything being buried in the wall above in there. And this is a moulded, one-piece moulded cap, an SCG one like this one. If you see, there is no cap as such, it's all one piece. So always buy SCG or a more expensive make that doesn't have a cap that looks like it's in two pieces. So I've got myself a new one of these, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in with a straight joint. And the reason that I've exposed all this pipe is simply so that I can move it, because when it was buried it was absolutely solid and there's no way I was going to get a final joint to actually click into place. But now I've got a pipe that moves all over the place, and this upper one moves a little bit as well, and that should enable me to get the final joint to actually go in place. Yeah, so I dug underneath that pipe so I could drop it down a little bit just to make sure that joint went in well. One thing I did notice with that particular valve was that when I was pushing the pipe in, the I don't know whether it's the shape of the valve or what it was, but the pipe was actually being pushed out again, so I had to hold it for a while quite firmly to try and get it to stay put near the mark that I'd made. In fact, it has come out very slightly, as the top one has as well. So there's about 1.5 centimetres to go into that valve, and I reckon I've lost about 1/4 of a centimetre on either end because the pipe has effectively pushed itself out. Sometimes you get that with joints, and if you feel it happen, you just have to push it in and hold it. Anyway, that's done. I want to leave it for 15 minutes just to make sure it's gone off properly, and then I will test it under pressure. Well, to be perfectly frank with you, that's a bit of a balls up on the way there. I've got there in the end, but I was picking up the wrong pieces and sticking them in. So I ended up with a pipe that I didn't want and stuck in a place I didn't want. And the piece I made last night in preparation effectively didn't work because the pipe going along here is actually sloping downwards for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. But obviously there's a bit of a dodgy joint somewhere that's started to make it slope downwards. So best laid plans, I had to amend them. Anyway, the basic shape is there. I've got an isolator valve for the big tank, the new one there. The existing one I'll just leave on. I'm not going to open, I should say. I'm not going to disturb that in case it starts leaking. So everything is exactly as I planned it in terms of the pipe layout. It's just that certain dimensions didn't work. Anyway, I've left myself a bit of room in case of any problems with joints, so I can cut things out and put in new things. I've just got to let that go off now. I think I'll leave it to go off for a good hour. Normally the joints are pressure proof and watertight after a few minutes, but I want to make sure. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the small tank. That'll test all the pipes from there under pressure. Well, as much pressure as it's going to get as it's a flow to the pump, but at least it'll give us some water into the house whilst the big tank is filling up. And then once I've had, I don't know, maybe a few hours of testing it under different pressures, and if the big tank can get full up and I can test that particular circuit, then I can cover all these joints up. I'm not going to cover anything up until I know they're all watertight. Well, the village water's been turned on and I can hear the tanks both filling up quite properly, and there are no leaks anywhere in any of the runs. We've had the water under pressure into the house for a few hours now, running off the small tank. No leaks anywhere. The pump has not been cycling without there being a tap on. So I'm quite confident that the job's done and all I've got to do now is replace the stones. Right, at this point I would just like to mention Paul Park, who runs a channel called Life by the Mekong, and he's built a house right next to the Mekong River, somewhere in godforsaken I don't know where, the middle of absolutely nowhere, about 1,000,000 miles away from Bangkok, and he's been having trouble with weeds. Yes, and he's tried to put down some material and then put some stones on top of that. Unfortunately it hasn't worked. Now Paul, this is what you need, mate. You need a huge, mungus, great big, thick layer of stones, like 5 to 10 centimetres. And the buggers, if they do grow through that, well, they're doing very well, I reckon. And if you get any seeds landing on top, then they will not be able to find the sand or the soil underneath. They will root, but they're easily picked out. So that's tip of the day, directly to Mr. Park, and I hope that it's not too late. Okay, that's pretty much done. Yes, looks okay, doesn't it? I think there's 1 or 2 stones out of place, but I'll deal with them later. Yes, I can see 1 or 2 I want to move. Anyway, that's another job done that's been nagging me for, well, ever since I built the house really. And I suppose if I'd realised that the pressure from that small tank there was pretty pathetic really, then I would have plumbed it into the mains like I've just done when I actually put all the pipes in originally. Never mind, it's not really any great bother to redo it. It's a nice challenge, another DIY project done, and everything's looking very neat and tidy again, thank goodness for that. And yes, a final apology to American in Thailand. I know this has been a very stressful video for you to watch, with all these stones, or as you call them, rocks, being thrown about, trodden on viciously and generally abused. I do apologise for that, but all is now restored and hopefully your therapist can sort you out.